I will give you my talk now. I usually start in the year of 1936. By that time, I was 8 years old, and I was living with my family, mother, father, and sister in Frankfurt, Germany. And I tried to make my story as authentic as possible because I do remember vividly practically all of the events that I'm going to describe in my talk. I don't want to make some fancy stories that didn't exist, so we'll go from there. 1936 is usually the year that I start. By that time, I was 8 years old, and it was the first year that I was able to go to summer camp with my sister. Summer camp was a very big event for kids my age and older, of course. And it was an interesting experience, and especially in 1936, that was the year of the Summer Olympics. And I remember only too well that in Germany, Hitler came to the fore and told everyone that this was the year where they're going to prove how the Aryan people were so far superior to anybody else, and he expected them to win practically all the medals in the events at the Olympics. Didn't quite turn out that way because there were a lot of other people, a lot of other countries that were participating and had just as good, or in many cases better, people in the Olympics. And it was, of course, the chagrin of Hitler that this was happening. He was sure that the Germans would be winning all the events of those Olympics. One particular event, of course, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and have heard of, was the great sprinter. Oh, I forgot his name. I'm sorry. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, there was one very famous American sprinter who won most of the medals in that particular event. And it was very upsetting to Hitler that this fellow, and I can't think of his name now, it just slipped my mind, won all these events. He was a Black American. He came from Cleveland, and he went to Ohio State. And his name, and I can't think of it. I'm sure if somebody can help me out. And he won most of the medals in those particular events. When it came time for him, and he was a Black American, and when it was time for him to get his medals, in those days, most of the events were held in a big stadium that held around 50 or 60,000 people in Berlin. And when it came time for him to get his medals, Hitler was supposed to hand them out, and of course he absolutely refused to hand bad enough to be American, but a Black American was more than he could stomach. So when it came time for this fellow to get his medals, he absolutely refused to give them to him. He stomped off the podium, and this guy was stuck at the podium and couldn't get the medal, which was a great embarrassment to him. I wish I could remember his name because it's like a household word. But we'll get to it later, I think. After the Olympics, and things went back to normal in Germany, things started really getting bad for the Jewish people in Germany. During the Olympics, they tried to hide everything, and they allowed things to take place. In fact, in the Olympics, the Germans deliberately had 2 Jews participating simply to show that there was no anti-Semitism and that things were normal. Of course, it was completely propaganda and untrue. After the Olympics were over, things started really getting bad again, or continued to get bad for Jewish people. There's all the different restrictions that were started during the big campaign right before the Olympics were put in effect. The Nuremberg laws, I'm sure many of you have heard of those, which had all kinds of terrible restrictions, were in effect. I'm not going to go through all the Nuremberg laws, it would take all day, but because many of the things were forbidden for Jewish people, they were no longer allowed to attend any kind of public events, such as theaters or movies or sporting events or anything where they would be in contact with non-Jewish people. That was strictly enforced right after the Olympics ended. All kinds of other things, like, for instance, purchasing groceries for women. In those days, there were no big grocery stores or supermarkets like we have today. There were little stores, little butcher shops, little bakeries, and little grocery stores and that type of thing. And the Jewish women were no longer permitted to make any purchases during the day. They would have to wait until 6 o'clock or whenever the store closed to purchase at exorbitant prices whatever was left over in that day, and that they were allowed to buy. This was just one of many different restrictions that took place. Other things, for example, were that we were no longer allowed to walk on sidewalks. We had to walk in the gutters. We were no longer allowed to attend any kind of events, public events, movies, football games, sporting events, any other events that took place were strictly forbidden for Jewish people. We were no longer allowed to own automobiles, ride on public transportation like streetcars, anything where there was any contact with non-Jewish people was prohibited. Even public schools were no longer allowed for Jewish kids. I no longer could go to the school I had been going to for many years. I had to go to a Jewish school, and it so happened the school wasn't bad. It was actually very good and probably better than the public school. It's just the idea of not being able to attend made it so uncomfortable and bad. Because to give you an example, I had a good friend, kid that I've been friendly with for many, many years. And we used to play together after school. I'd go to his house. He would come to my house. And one evening I was at his house and we were having a good time. And all of a sudden his dad came in the room and he said to me, "Felix, go home immediately. I don't ever want to see you in my house again." And I was really taken aback. Well, I couldn't imagine what I had done. Had I broken something? Had I said something? What was wrong? What did I do to get that kind of treatment? Because the day before before all that time, we were good friends. We enjoyed each other's company, played together, and had a good time. So I went home with tears in my eyes and told my dad what had happened. And my dad explained to me that that particular day, a law had been passed that Jews and Gentiles were no longer allowed to meet together or live together or come together in social events of any kind whatsoever. There was to be a strict separation. And my dad said, not for me to worry, it wasn't my fault, and so on and so forth. That was just one of many things. And things gradually got worse as time went by. Eventually, my dad lost his business. He had a very thriving textile wholesale business. We had salesmen all over the country, even in foreign countries in Europe, and he was doing very well. That was taken away from him for a pittance of the value of the business. Two Nazis that were in the business were given the business, taken over. They got the business for practically nothing. And as I said, this was just one of many events, and it's getting worse as time went by. And by 1938, 2 years later, we had what was known as Kristallnacht. You may have heard of it, Kristallnacht in German. And that event took place in November of 1938. And that particular night, they had all kinds of pogroms. Pogroms consisted of the complete destruction of every synagogue in Germany. There were over 700 synagogues in Germany during that time. On that night, every single synagogue was completely destroyed. They were either burnt to the ground, or those that had adjacent buildings where they had to be careful that they didn't burn down somebody's house. Those were just destroyed from within. That was just one of many events on that particular night. They arrested thousands of people, especially younger Jewish men, and they were sent to concentration camps, thousands of them. And when they were sent to these concentration camps, they had to make a promise. This was, mind you, before the actual Holocaust. This was before the gas chambers and the crematorium and the death camps. This was not yet the worst part of the Holocaust. But these people that were sent to the concentration camps had to make a promise to leave the country within a certain period of time, or they would be rearrested. And if they were rearrested, they no longer would have the ability or be allowed to leave the camp. And of course, none of these people that had been arrested on that night of pogroms were able to make that promise. They made the promise anyway, but they had no way of fulfilling it. They had no way to leave the country. Those people that had been able to leave the country, for the most part, had already left Germany. They had relatives, friends, somebody that could give them in foreign countries, somebody that would be able to give them what they call an affidavit and a visa. Those you would need in order to be admitted to foreign countries, especially the United States. Very difficult to come into. It was more difficult to go into a new country that you wanted to than it was to leave. The Germans were happy that if you left. And like I said, things got worse and worse as time went by. Other things besides burning down the synagogues, arresting thousands of people for the concentration camps. They destroyed every retail store that was still in Jewish hands. Most of the businesses had already been taken away or sold, when I say sold, for small pittance. My father's business was given to two Nazis that had worked for him, and it was practically nothing that he got for his business. And of course, this was the case in many of the retail establishments that were in all over Germany. And things got worse and worse and worse. More restrictions, homes were taken away from Jewish people. Businesses, of course, were already well on their way of being taken away. And things got much worse as time went by. The Kristallnacht was on November the 9th, 1938. And by the end of that month of 1938, November of 1938, there was a new thing that had been established, not in Germany, but in the outside, basically with the help of British Jews. It was called the Kindertransport. You may have heard of it. The Kindertransport existed of kids between the ages of 2 and 16. Yes, 2. And they were allowed to leave England, allowed to leave Germany to go to England from Germany without being accompanied by their families, besides being accompanied without their parents, the children on their own. Now, this was a terrible ordeal for the parents, of course, to send their children away, not knowing when, if and when they would see their kids again. And people were desperate because they couldn't leave, so there was only a hope that the children would survive. And this started at the end of November of 1938. Now, mind you, that's before the war. The war started on the 3rd of September of 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. My turn did not come. I was on what is known as the Kindertransport. There were usually trains of approximately 400 kids on the train. That usually they would start when the ones from the western part of Europe in Prague, Czechoslovakia, which already had been occupied by the Germans. And from Prague, the train would go to Vienna, Austria, which had become annexed to Germany, became part of Germany. And then from there, the train would wind its way along southern Germany, along the western part, along the Rhine rivers, picking up more children. And there were usually about 400 kids on the train, Jewish kids. Eventually, there was 10,000 children that were rescued, that were saved. Actually 9,983 or something like that, that were able to survive. Most of these children, when they lived in England with people that they never knew, never ever saw their families again. 9,000 out of the 10,000 never saw their families again. My turn did not come until 1939. My train left on the 10th of August, 1939. My train was the one before the last train of the Kindertransport. And then of course, the war started, and that became completely impossible. That no longer existed. And I still remember to this day, as vividly as on the day when it happened, on the night when it happened, when I woke up in the morning. To the kids, this whole episode was a big adventure. There was no question in our mind that we would be reunited with our families again very soon. When, we didn't know exactly, but that we would never see them again, never even came to our mind. And I remember waking up that morning on the 10th of August in 1939, and my mom was lying on my bed beside me, tears rolling down her face, because this was going to be the last day that she would ever see her son. And she had premonitions, which unfortunately came true, that there was to be no reunification that would exist, because my parents and my sister, instead of leaving on a train to go to England or somewhere in the West, 2 years later in 1941, were sent to a ghetto in Poland, and from there eventually to concentration camp. And I needn't tell you what the fate was in the concentration camp. Getting back to my story, and like I said, we had all, and when I talked about the summer camp, it was for the reason, because that as kids, we were used to being away from home in the summer for usually 6 to 8 weeks. And so we were used to it and we enjoyed it and loved it. And we thought going to England for a little while by ourselves, living with other kids and other people, was going to be a big adventure. Not even dreaming of that there would be never any reunification. We got ourselves ready. My mom went with me shopping for all kinds of clothes that I might need when I get older, grow. Unfortunately, I didn't grow a great deal, but I did have to have new clothes and all kinds of different things. The whole thing was going to be a big adventure. And we got on the 10th of August, train pulled in Frankfurt, and we were part of this contingent of 400 children that would wind up in England. And all the kids on these trains were very happy-go-lucky, because most of them had been on summer camp, were used to being away from home, didn't bother them one bit. It was just a matter of time before they would reunite with their families. And so we were a bunch of happy kids. The older kids, like I said before, you probably wondered how I could talk about 2-year-old babies going on trains. Can you imagine a mother, as bad as it's leaving your child as it is, but you have to leave a 2-year-old baby, 2-year-old babies to be left on a train in the hands of complete strangers, not knowing if they would see them again. It's pretty hard to imagine. But out of sheer desperation, these people, these moms and dads, let their kids go. But sometime when you have nothing better to do, try and get a film called Into the Arms of Strangers about the Kindertransport. And it shows you some of the experiences of these kids. It's unbelievable that these sheer desperation, these things took place. We got on the train and we went along to different cities to pick up more kids. And eventually we wound up on the border near the Rhine River, and we left to go across into Holland. And as we left, the SS stormtroopers came on the train. By that time, there would be probably 400 kids on the train. By that time, we got to the Dutch border, and these SS men would yell at us and tell us, once you leave Germany, you will never be allowed to come back. And everyone, of course, yelled, hooray, we don't want to come back anyway, we're only too happy to leave. Little did I realize that 7 years to the day, almost, I came back in the American Army uniform to Germany. Anyway, we crossed the border and were greeted by these wonderful Dutch ladies who immediately took care of us. They would give us sandwiches and milk and cookies, what have you, as we were on our way to England. And we would go to the English Channel and board a ferry. In those days, they didn't have tunnels under the English Channel. Today, if you cross the English Channel, it takes you about 45 minutes. You can do it by car, bus, train, all kinds of different forms of transportation. In those days, all you could do was go on a ferry. And we were a happy bunch of kids. The older kids, the teenagers, would take care of the babies. There weren't that many. I'm not trying to tell you that there were hundreds of thousands of little babies. They're usually about 2 or 3 2-year-olds or something like that on these transports, not very many. We all became seasick, didn't bother us, we got over it. We left from the port of Hoek van Holland, the 25-mile trip across the English Channel. English Channel is always very rough, and of course everybody became seasick, but we survived. We were out of Germany. That was the biggest event that we had accomplished. When we arrived in Harwich, England, port of Harwich, we were put on a train and immediately taken to London. And as we were on this train talking about our events, everyone was mentioning who would meet them in London, Liverpool Street Station. And everyone had someone. For the life of me, I couldn't remember, didn't know, no one had told me who was going to meet me in London. And when we arrived in London at Liverpool Street Station, we all got off the train, and here stood I by myself, not a soul there to meet me, and I had no idea what on earth I would be doing now that I was in England by myself. Believe me, the frightening experience for an 11-year-old kid with maybe 5 marks in his pocket and not knowing who and not being able to speak the language. My English that I had studied was certainly not adequate to be able to make good conversation. Finally, someone from the kinder transport that had brought us there came over to me with 1,000 questions, which I had no answer. Who is going to meet you? Where are you going? What is your name? Where do you come? All kinds of questions. The only thing I could tell them, my name is Felix Weil. I couldn't even understand the language they were talking. So they quickly went through their record And in those days, for the kinder transport, the records were very, very inadequate. It was all done very hurriedly and very unprofessionally. Hand-scribbled notes of who the kids were. And they went through the records and they couldn't find the name of Felix Weil on these records. The closest they came to was the name of a girl by the name of Felicia Weil. Felicia, of course, is very, very close to Felix in name. Felicia was nowhere to be found. She never got on the train. And somehow or other there was a mix-up, and that's how Felix Weil got on the kinder transport. And of course, it was a big mistake that had been made, and it was to my fortune, you might say, and the misfortune of this young lady by the name of Felicia. How much time do I have? Got about 15 minutes. Okay. I have a few more things I must tell you about. What to do with Felix Weil? There was no place. This was now 3 weeks before the war started, and there were very few people, very few families at the time when the war was ready to break out that were interested in taking a young 11-year-old kid into their home. Things were bad enough as they were. And so they put me in a hostel. And this was a hostel for all girls, teenage girls in early 20s that had come on different kinder transports. And when I think about it during my years, if I had only been a little older than an 11-year-old and had all these girls to myself, it would have been wonderful. But an 11-year-old, not really that girl crazy. Anyway, I was in this hospital. The girls were wonderful. They took good care of me. They let me enjoy their company, and we played piano in the evening. Eventually, that hospital became very famous. In fact, there's a book that's written called The Children of Williston Lane. If you ever have a chance to read it, it's the most fabulous book, The Children of Williston Lane. It's about Mona Gola Beck, who became a very famous pianist and was in the Royal Academy of Music, accepted. And it's a fantastic story. So if you can get it in the library or buy the book, do it. You'll enjoy it. Just a little sideline. Okay. I was with this in this hostel for a matter of 3 weeks, and then the war broke out. September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and of course the war started. Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September of 1939. And then after that came the evacuation. You may have heard about that over the years. They tried to evacuate all the kids, certain age group, from London throughout England, throughout the Midlands, throughout countryside, to Scotland, to Wales, and so forth, to get them away from the forthcoming Blitz. I'm sure you all know what happened to London. It was terribly, terribly destroyed and bombed. Excuse me. And most kids, younger kids especially, that were not able to help in the war effort were sent away in the countryside. And I was sent away. I was on a train from London to Northampton. And on the train, by that point in time, I spoke hardly any English at all. There was very little English that I was able to speak. And it was very different. All these kids were English kids, and they came from different schools, different parts of London. Somehow or other, I managed to meet two kids on that train, two brothers that came from Berlin. Their father happened to be one of the most prominent attorneys in Berlin. And somehow or other we met each other, and we were the only three kids that couldn't speak any English. And we were on this train, and we were sent to this little village in Northamptonshire, about 5 miles out of Northampton. We were in a big social hall. There were several hundred kids, and there were families in that little hall looking for kids that they would not adopt, but have stay with them during the war. And the young lady came in, and the two brothers had gotten separated from me. And this lady approached them, and she spoke perfect German. And she said, "Oh, this is a good idea. I'll take you two guys. I'll teach you English, and you can help me some more with my German." And somehow or other, they were taken to her house. Before they left, she said, "Oh, by the way, we have a beautiful big house, and we can take another kid. Certainly, you might need another friend anyway." So they said, "There's a little boy over there, and leaning on the wall, looks very lonesome, and he's in the same predicament that we're in. Can't speak a word of English, and I'm sure he would be more than happy to join us." Sure enough, you know who that kid was. I managed to be able to go with them. We lived with this family for the entire duration of the war. They were a very, very wealthy family, had a big estate. They had a chauffeur and a gardener and about 8 or 9 different maids, pantry maid, drawing room maid. I don't know the whole list of that. But they were the most wonderful people. They knew nothing about Judaism, had absolutely no knowledge of that. When I told them that about a year from now, I would have to be bar mitzvah, they didn't know even what I was talking about, which is understandable. But they were the kindest people, and we participated in all their events. At Christmas time, we participated in gift giving, dinner, and all those things. They didn't make us go to church. We went on weekends. The nearest town was Northampton, and we would have to go to Jewish events, Jewish services, and so forth. They insisted that we keep up our Judaism, and they were extremely kind and helpful and understanding. And we went to school. First, we went to a local village school, and the headmaster told this lady that even though we didn't speak English, we seemed to be way ahead of the kids in that little village school when it came to sciences and math and that kind of thing. So they thought to immediately that we went to the grammar school. they call it in England, they call it the public school in Northampton, which actually is a private school and very expensive. And the lady of the house saw to it that we went there for our education. In the summertime, we went to summer camps, and we went to Boy Scout camps. We had joined the Boy Scouts. We were very active. I first became patrol leader, and then I was troop leader, and met some nice kids, village kids in that troop of Boy Scouts. And we were sent to a fruit farm. In those days, this was during the war, and all the help that could be given doing work for the war effort was very much needed. There were very few men around, as you well imagine. It was right after Dunkirk, after the British Army came back from France, and all kinds of things took place. We would have paper drives, collect all kinds of things for the war effort. We were very fortunate that there was very little bombing in our area. In fact, that's why we were sent there. And a few nights we had some bad bombing attacks. Obviously, the German pilots missed their target because the bombs all wound up in the field, created huge craters, that kind of thing. I stayed there for the entire duration of the war. And then after the war ended, my aunt and uncle in New York, my mother's sister and her family, wanted me to come to live with them. So there was no chance of going there until the war ended, because all shipping, all transportation was for the war effort, military, that type of thing. But right before the war ended, I was able to come to the United States. I lived with my aunt and uncle in New York for a couple of years before going to college. And my Army service was right after the war ended. I was in the 1st Division, stationed, believe it or not, in my hometown where I'd been born, in Frankfurt. And when I arrived, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe the story unless you hear it from someone that can tell you. The train stopped at a platform which was the same platform that I had last seen my family. And you can imagine what an emotional experience that was for me to be there in the same place. Until the war had ended, I had no idea about concentration. It was hidden from us very well. We heard about camps, but no one even gave it any thought of such a thing as a death camp. It didn't enter our mind. And until I came back and when I came to Frankfurt and found out what had happened to my family, I had no way of knowing what was going on. I was in the Army for about a year and a half, came back to the United States, went to Kent State University, got my degree, and then worked in Northampton. No, I'm getting all mixed up. I was in the United States by then. I worked in Dayton, Ohio, where I spent the rest of my time. And then I came here about 2 or 3 years ago. And with that, I think I'd like to end, and I would like to thank you again for tuning in. We'll have a question and answer period. Join us here next Wednesday, September the 16th at 10 a.m. to hear another story of survival. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the week ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times. Thank you very much. Now, if we have question answers, I'll be more than happy to try to answer them.
Hi, Felix. Thank you. Before we do that, just Courtney said she thinks that the athlete you were mentioning at the beginning is Jesse Owens. Is that?
Thank you very much. So stupid of me. I've known that name for 100 years.
I was blanking on the name too, so I'm happy Courtney knew it. It was in the comments right away. Did you want to share your pictures first before we do the Q&A?
Let's do that.
Okay.
That's yours truly. That's before I went to England, a little bit before. That's my sister. My sister was 2.5 years older than I was. She was not as fortunate as I was. She was with my mother and father and wound up in the lodge ghetto and then in concentration camp. That is my sister and yours truly. I think I was around 35. No, not quite. 35 weeks. And that's a gorgeous pair, if you've ever seen one. My sister was very beautiful. That's my mom and dad. In those days when they went out to a resort, they walked on and they didn't wear shorts and t-shirt or anything. My dad wore a tie and a suit and a jacket. And that's how they were going on a vacation. I think that was in Switzerland someplace. That I don't need to tell you who that is. Oh, yeah, I guess I should, because you haven't seen me. Most people have seen me. That was me in the army. Handsome young man, you must admit. Frankfurt, how it looked when I got back. It was just unimaginable. It was the most beautiful city. When I was a little kid, I had a wonderful time, had lots of friends. We went out to the airport and used to see the Graf Zeppelin. You must have heard of that. And the Hindenburg, the two airships the Germans had, take off and land. And when I came back, this was in between the main station, the main railroad station, and the river Rhine. And that's all that was left. Complete destruction. Just unbelievable. Beautiful old houses. Another picture of destruction. That's a grave. A few years ago, well, probably around 8 or 9, 10 years ago, my wife and I visited Frankfurt. That is the grave of my grandparents. Both my grandparents' sets on both sides are buried in Frankfurt. That gravestone needs a good cleaning. But that was one of the gravestones of on my mother's side parents. That is a little marker. In the city of Frankfurt, there were 10,000 Jews that were sent to concentration camps. There were 25,000 originally in Frankfurt. 15,000 have gotten out. 10,000 were sent to concentration. This is they put up little bronze markers. This is for my dad. His name's Ludwig. He was first sent to Lodz, that's the ghetto in Poland. and so there was a marker there for him. But these are what they call the Stolpersteine. I don't know if you have ever heard of that. Many of the cities in Frankfurt put up these markers right in the sidewalks with the names of people that lived in those buildings, and whether it was an apartment house or a home, so that they would never be forgotten. That's for my dad, my mom, and my sister. And these are these little plaques that have been embedded in the sidewalks so that people would never forget who had lived there.
All right, we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
Let me get those pulled up real quick. The first one I've got is Courtney says, how heartbreaking to hear about your friend's father sending you home. Did you ever speak to that friend again in secret or hear from him after the war?
No, never. Never saw him again, never spoke to him again. But I did meet my neighbors when I came back to Frankfurt in the army. The neighbors were next to our house. And the lady, as she saw me look at the house, came over to me and said, "Oh, Felix, how are you? So good to see you." But I had a feeling that her thoughts were more, "Felix, why aren't you dead? Aren't you supposed to be in the concentration camp in the gas chamber?"
Okay. Let's see. Our next question is considering that they were just separated from their families, how were other kids on the train handling everything?
Well, like I mentioned in my talk, a very large percentage of the kids were the same kind of situation that I was. They had been away to summer camps, had been used to being away from their families, and no one in their wildest dreams had gave any thought that they wouldn't be reunited. So they were all a bunch of happy-go-lucky kids. It was like a big vacation trip that we were going on. We were going to a new country. We were going to learn a new language. We were going to meet new kids. And above all, we would be treated like human beings, not subhuman. We were getting rid of the terrible element of Germans that didn't have anything good to say about it.
Okay.
So it was a big,
Go ahead.
good experience. And of course, we didn't realize what was to come.
What surprised you most about moving to England and then the US?
What was what? I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
What surprised you most about moving to England and the US?
What surprised me the most? That the English people are very kind, very considerate, and accepted us for what we were, where we came from, tried to be helpful. And we had very, very little, if any, anti-Semitism in England during our stay there. We were accepted. The only thing that really annoyed us, they had a Corps of Cadets in a school, in other words, for training for the army. And in the first few years, we weren't allowed to go because we were considered enemy aliens coming from Germany, which is only understandable, but we were enemy aliens. Not because we were Jewish, or not because they didn't like us or anything, but easily understood how they felt. We came from Germany and we were enemy aliens. But otherwise, we had friends in England that accepted us and were just like them. And it was a very good experience. I can't complain at all.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that. Heidi has asked, how did you feel when you were drafted?
I accepted it. I felt it was my duty, more than anybody else for that matter, that that the enemy was certainly mine as much or more than the American GIs, and I fully accept it. My cousin had been drafted. He won the Purple Heart at Anzio Beachhead in Italy, and we all of the kids that came from Germany were eager actually to be part of the army. They felt that their responsibility and duty, and certainly had no bad feelings, you might say. Nothing like that.
Brilliant. What did you do after the war, and how did you meet your wife?
After the war, I went to school at the university, Kent State University in Ohio, and then I became an accountant. Then I met my wife in a resort. My wife came from Montreal, Canada, and we met in Lake Placid, New York. I don't know if you ever heard of Lake Placid, New York. It's a beautiful place. I was there on vacation and happened to meet her there. She was in a girls' summer camp, and she lived in Montreal. I lived in Dayton, Ohio, and the telephone call bill became too high, so we thought the only solution was to get married.
That is so sweet. I do have one more question that we have time for. What would you like future generations to know about the Holocaust and about your story?
About the Holocaust and about what?
Your story.
It's very hard to say something about that. I mean, I try to tell my grandkids, they're now in college, and I try to tell them different things about it. And to get the same feeling that I have is very difficult. They have their lives to lead, but at the same time, I don't want them to forget what happened to their families, to their grandparents in particular. I make a big effort that they learn, and they're very polite. They try to absorb everything and try to participate. But I can understand that it's not the same as when you experience it. But I think they're good kids. They have learned a great deal. And of course, to try and be able to get along with other people, it's not that easy. Kids have different feelings, but we have to do something. As you well know, and I know, that things are not getting better, that anything getting worse. And how we're going to get over all this is mind-boggling. That's about all I can tell you about that.
Well, thank you so much. I do have one more question that just came in. Did you reconnect with the family you stayed with in England?
Absolutely. Of course, most of them have passed away now. I mean, they were all older than I am. So, but I went several times to England, about 5 or 6 times in the last 20 years or so. And I came to England and visited them.
That is all the time we have right now. So I'm going to let you say goodbye to everybody. And thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I wish I could see the faces. Unfortunately, it's not possible. But I'm happy to.
Hopefully soon. Thank you, Felix.
I'll be at the museum soon, so that if anybody wants to meet me, I've been a docent there for a couple of years, and so if they want to meet me, then find out when I'm there. I called the museum. And of course, right now it's not open. I mean, we don't have any lectures or anything. When it comes about again, I'll be more than happy to introduce myself.
Great, thank you so much. That's all for today. Thank everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.